Welcome back to On the Fly. We're previewing the predicting and recapping World Junior Championships, our Men's World Championships, the Women's World Championship, the U18 Men's World Championship. Expect the unexpected.
Absolute abomination of the Canadian Junior National Team.
I have a couple extra words I want to use in that one. And it's Freebird. Freebird, Freebird, Freebird. Of course, the Olympics are just around the corner. I'm going to coin it the rivalry day.
In World Junior history!
Your home for international hockey. This is On the Fly. And hello everyone, and welcome back to On the Fly, your home for international hockey. I'm your host, Parker McLean, and you're listening to episode number 4 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast. Today we're going to be diving into some recent coaching and management changes for Canada, Czechia, and the USA, taking a look ahead to the 2028 World Cup of Hockey, the men's U18 tournament, and some pivotal Division 1A matchups. And of course, we'll be answering your live questions towards the end of the program today. If you're hanging out with us live on YouTube, thank you for being here on this beautiful Sunday afternoon, depending on where you are watching from. Be sure to smash that like button, hit the subscribe button to join our international hockey community. If you're catching us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. You can also find us on Instagram, X, and TikTok at OnTheFly1515. But with that, we'll hop into it today, starting with our first topic of discussion. Of course, that is the recent changes for the Czech national program when it comes to their coaching staff, with Radim Rulík, who is now out as Czech bench boss. He will be departing to Kladno to go back to Czechia and coach more of that club side type of role. But you think about his sort of impact on the Czech program, and in many ways, he was one of the reasons why the Czechs have had this big turnaround in their program history. And you think to his original role when he first came in back in 2022, tasked with turning around the World Junior program. And, you think about it and you can see the Canada gear here. He did a pretty good job of doing that, right? And you think to their recent success, wasn't necessarily a part of that success, but really laid the groundwork for that change. And you date it back to the 2022 tournament, started with a bit of a tough performance, you could say, inside that, the preliminary round action where there were a few games in there that you probably wanted back. You get a win against the Slovaks early on, a shootout loss against a really tough Finnish team that year. Of course, they ended up going on to play for gold. And then losing to Canada, a 5-1 loss, and that one 5-2 loss to Latvia following that game. That game against Latvia was one that they very much would have wanted back at the end of this tournament, but still, right? It doesn't matter what happened at the start of the tournament, it only matters about how you finish it. And then they go on to the quarterfinal round and they play against the US team, who really was the dominant force at this tournament, walked through the preliminary round, blew out every team they played. They went on to beat the Swedes by a pretty comfortable margin as well. And it was one of those dominant type performances throughout the prelims for the US team that was a bit of a scare for the Czech team, and expectations relatively low, right? And you look at the Czech team where not necessarily expected, to kind of contend with teams like the US, especially at that point in time. But they go out and they beat the US, a huge 4-2 win in that one, kind of putting themselves back on the map at this World Junior Tournament. It was their first time making it forward from the quarterfinals since 2018. And so it had been a bit of a stretch for the Czechs kind of returning back to the promised land and getting to play for a medal. An unfortunate loss for them against Canada, 5-2 loss at that in the semis, led them to the bronze medal game, where unfortunately for them fell up just a little bit short against the Swedes with a 3-1 loss there. But in many ways, this kind of became the stepping stone for what was to come the following year in 2023, where this was kind of that pivotal moment for the Czech program, where what we've seen now and what we continue to see 2024, 2025, 2026 is in many ways kind of kickstarted by the big win in 2023, where they end up beating Canada 5-2 in the opening game. And that game, you think back to it, it was a bit of a shocker at that point in time. Yes, they just came off a big win against the US the year prior, But even that game felt like a bit of a lucky one for the Czechs. But then the 2023 performance came around, and it kind of reinforced the fact that the Czechs were here to stay. They weren't just a team that got lucky in this tournament, but instead they were going to continue to be a thorn in the top team side. A huge win to start the tournament back in 2023 for the Czechs as they beat Canada 5-2. Then they continued their success, beating Austria 9-0. They end up losing in overtime to the Swedes 3-2 as a final in that one. That was a bit of a tough game for them there, but a very competitive one where, quite frankly, they probably should have won that game as well. And they beat Canada early on in the tournament. They set themselves up well. They finish off the prelim strong, beating Germany 8-1, locking up the top seed in the group. Of course, having a tough group in Canada and Sweden that they had to go through, they end up securing that top spot, which gives them a much easier path in. They beat Switzerland 9-1 in the quarters, a pretty blowout type game, if I do say so myself. Then to the second game of the semifinals, where you look at it, right? A 2-1 win in overtime against the Swedes after already losing once to the Swedes earlier on in the tournament in overtime as well. It was kind of that moment where we saw the coaching staff kind of elevate its game, putting forth not only the structure to beat teams like the Swedes, but also having that type of calming presence on the bench. We're going to win this game kind of attitude, and it does go a long way, and we really saw it here as they did knock off the Swedes in the semifinals, which sent them to their first gold medal game at the World Juniors since 2001. You can also throw in 2000 in there as they went back to back. Both those tournaments they did win gold in, and so going to the final game against the Canadians, a team that they already beat in the opening game of the prelims, Canada was on home ice, and quite frankly, they got out to a bit of a good stretch early for the Canadians, but the Czechs quickly reminded them that you can't take naps against them because of the way that they play and the way they implement their structure. And so you end up seeing the Czechs claw their way back. They tie the game. Overtime comes around, and whenever you get to a 3-on-3 overtime, it is anyone's game. And ultimately, Dylan Guenther with the goal that put Canada on top. But you look at this tournament for the Czechs, this was the kind of that one memorable tournament that kickstarted in many ways the rest of this Czech program. Yes, the 2022 win over the Americans set forth this motion that the Czechs were going to continue to be a competitive team at this tournament, but the win, or the silver medal, I guess you could say, at the World Juniors in 23 was really that first step forward for this Czech team. A huge win for them to pick up the silver. Nearly taking home the gold would have been their first, and so won. But in the end, a silver medal for them at that tournament. And then for Rulík, it became, well, what's next, right? And he decided not to go back to the World Junior team. He passed it down to now Patrick Augusta, he'll be on the move as well. We'll see whether or not he's going to be the next guy up for this Czech team. But he then moves on to the World Championships. And the Men's World Championships in 2024, our first year of kind of covering this tournament, at least the Men's World, it was quite the historied run for the Czech team. And you think about it coming in, right? Their last medal at this tournament was in 2022, where they took home the bronze medal. They had a few fourth place finishes in around that span the years prior, but never were able to kind of make it to that next step. 2010 was the last time they won the gold medal. And so going on home ice, they had gold in their sights. And in many ways, that's what they were hoping to do at this tournament. And you think about on home ice, the home ice advantage, and we'll be talking a little bit about our World Cup segment coming up and about the home ice there for this Czech team, but a huge opportunity on home ice to deliver a performance for their fans. And so it was great to see, right? And you start the tournament with a huge win against the Finns, a shootout win, a big win to start the tournament. You know, you kind of come into these tournaments, you want to kind of get a feel for, well, what's to come, how hard are we going to be played. But when you start the tournament with a big win against a good team, it sets you up well moving forward. Then they go on, they beat Norway 6-3. They lose to Switzerland, a 2-1 shootout loss, kind of setting the tone for an eventual rematch game. A reminder that these two did end up meeting in the gold medal game. 7-4 win against Denmark, 4-0 win against Austria, 4-1 win against Great Britain, and then they go and they play Canada, a 4-3 overtime loss there, but a very competitive matchup. You kind of see just how competitive those two teams were in that game, which then sent them on to the quarterfinal round. They were the third seed in their group, which means they got the second seed in the Americans for the quarterfinals. They did beat the Americans a 1-0 game, and it was kind of one of those games that for Rulík, you expect him at some point in time to be that kind of coach that's okay with playing that defensive system and being okay in those tight type of games, because that's the kind of performance that you expect when he is behind the bench. And really across all of those tournaments, that was the kind of game that you were expecting to see. We saw it in that quarterfinals. The Czechs looked very comfortable in that game, which then sent them on to the semifinals, where they ended up playing the Swedes. They delivered a 7-3 win over the Swedes in that one. And that was a great game for them, for the Czechs too, where you kind of think about the performances that the Czechs needed to beat a team like the Swedes, a star-studded roster as always. The Czechs found their way through, and they relied on their key players. They relied on players like David Pastrnak, players like Roman Chervenka, players that you become so accustomed to seeing on this Czech program that, quite frankly, it wasn't that much of a surprise they ended up beating them. 7-3, I'd say a little bit more so. But for the Czechs, this was the game they needed to build that momentum going in to the final game, that gold medal game against the Swiss, where, once again, it was a little bit more of that tight checking game. Another kind of 1-0 game, another 1-0 performance, where in the end they also get the empty net goal. They take home the gold medal on home ice, a 2-0 win in that one. And it was kind of the glory days, and I'd say the pinnacle, the peak of Rulík's term with this Czech program. Obviously, you come off of a silver medal at the 23 World Juniors. You follow it up with the gold medal at the World Championships. And then 2025 rolls around, and that's last year's Men's World Championship tournament, where it was a bit of a disappointing end, I'd say. And they start off red hot, right? They start off with a 5-4 overtime win against the Swiss, a rematch of the prior year's gold medal game. Follow it up with a 2-1 win against Norway, 7-2 win against Denmark, 6-1 win over Hungary, 8-1 win over Kazakhstan, 5-0 win over Germany. And then they play the U.S., right? And the whole debate around, well, they need a win. They get the win. They earn themselves the top spot in the group. They get some points. They earn themselves up the top spot in the group. But unfortunately for them, they lost in regulation, which sent them to the third spot in the group, set up probably one of the toughest matchups in the Swedes. Home ice Sweden 2, I may add on top of that. The 5-2 loss against the Americans in the last game of the prelims made them play the Swedes, where they lost 5-2 against the Swedish team. A tough loss for this Czech squad. But once again, right, it was another performance where one game ends up costing them. In the grand scheme of things, it was a bit of an unfortunate result for them. Once again, though, they played well, right? And they had a good tournament. Unfortunately, the results side just weren't quite there. And especially after a World Championship performance where you come the gold medal the year before that, you want to follow it up with another win. Unfortunately for the Czechs, 6th place finish at that Men's World Championship tournament. But then we moved to the Olympic Games, and that was, a month ago now. And an 8th place finish at that tournament. Of course, they start off with probably one of the worst preliminary rounds they could have had. 5-0 loss against the Canadians, a 6-3 win over France, but another game where it was probably a little bit more competitive than what they would have liked. Then a 4-3 overtime loss against Switzerland, which set them up to be the 8th seed overall. They played Denmark in that qualification round, a 3-2 win in that qualification round. But once again, not really the type of performance you would have wanted to see from them. You would have looked to have them be a little bit more dominant in that game. And then they have to go play Canada. And coming to this one, expectations were relatively low. They got blown out earlier in the tournament in that prelim round against the Canadian team. And so for the Czechs, as much as, yes, you would have liked to eventually had them kind of go on and win the tournament, the fact that they lost their game against the Swiss ended up costing them dearly at the end of this tournament. They nearly go out and they nearly beat Canada, probably one of their best performances they had all tournament. But in the end, a little bit too little, too late, a player too many. And in the end, kind of the end in many ways of Rulík's term here with the Czechs losing to the Canadians 4-3 in overtime, an 8th place finish at the Olympic Games, which then sets up, well, what's next for the Czech team, right? And, Marek Sedličky is going with Rulík over to Kladno, same with Tomáš Placanec. And so the question becomes, well, who's next, right? Because whoever's coming in next gets a new set of assistant coaches, new set of really whoever they want on their staff. And so there are a few kind of names that you would consider, I'd say, in many ways for this Czech national program. And one of the obvious ones is Patrik Augusta, the former World Juniors coach for this team. He's been quite the staple over the last few years for the Czechs, and he's a guy that I'd say you'd have full confidence with going forward. A reminder as well, and for those who don't know, they're expecting that the replacement will be joining the World Championship staff coming up in mid-May, so there is the likelihood that you will see and the replacement will be named before then. But Rulík is out following his term at the World Championships. He will serve it, and then from there, the new coach will take over. And then Pavel Gross is another one who is kind of in the conversation, I'd say kind of a leading one. Zdeněk Moták is another guy who I'd say has the chance to. Moták and Gross, two guys that I'd say are kind of the favorites in many ways to be that next guy up. I would say Augusta should be the next guy in, but I know that is a widely contested topic of discussion, and whether or not he would even accept the role, right? And for Augusta, having the World Juniors run kind of exposes you a little bit to that pressure side, but especially for a country like Czechia, where hockey is so prevalent and is so popular, it becomes a very important role, not only, and a lot of pressure will also come with it. And so for Augusta, whether or not he'd want the role becomes a whole other topic of discussion. And then the other guy who I'd say, and this is where kind of the politics side of the hockey world kind of comes in with Václav Varada, where you may end up going with Varada because of the fact that he's a kind of guy that, kind of hard-nosed coach. He plays kind of that but he encourages that kind of hard defensive first mindset hockey, which I personally believe the Czechs would excel with. But I can also appreciate the fact that, you look at the management right now and who's doing the selection process for the Czech head coach role. They've had some issues in the past, and so Varada probably not going to be on the top of their list. Still a guy that I think should definitely be considered for this role. Kind of the combination of hard-nosed coaching, defensive first mentality is a huge opportunity for this Czech team. But we'll see, right? And it's part of the joy of it. Varada, Augusta, Gross, and Moták likely will be the four coaches in the sort of names in the ring for this head coaching role coming up following the end of the World Championships. You can expect this decision to be made probably over the next month or so. I'd assume it will take place before the World Championships coming up on May 15th. Lots to talk about, lots of excitement starting to generate around that tournament. And of course, we are moving into kind of that busy stretch once again. Next week, we kick back off the IIHF tournaments. And so it's great to see the international game coming back. April 22nd, of course, the start of the men's U18 tournament, which we'll talk about a little bit as well. And then the Women's Worlds at the very end of November, so that's going to be a little bit longer of a wait. But still, once again, great to have international hockey back. We'll have our full coverage for the Men's World Championships, and we'll see if Rulík can end up having, of course, his one last go at it and maybe just take home a gold medal. And we'll move on now to topic number 2. And for topic number 2, a bit of an interesting discussion where we have two events that have had changes, maybe in location, maybe cancellations, maybe date changes. We're going to see. And we'll start here with the first one, which is the Men's Division 2A World Championships, which were originally supposed to take place in Al Ain, UAE, from April 20th to 26th. And so for this tournament, once again, a safety concern was what was cited with the UAE, as well as travel costs. It was announced earlier, about a week, kind of right at the end of our last podcast, so it would have been last Monday. They announced that Australia would likely not be going to this tournament, citing travel costs and safety reasons as the primary concerns. But now the question becomes, well, what's to come, right? And so for this tournament, of course, you have the 6 teams. Croatia, the Division 1B relegated team from last year. Serbia, who came the 2nd spot. UAE, the 3rd spot. Belgium, the 4th spot. And Australia, the 5th spot. Georgia is the 6th place team coming into this tournament, the Division 2B team from last year's tournament, and they really just decimated their competition. Now the question becomes is this tournament going to even happen? Will we have promotion for next year's tournament? And it is a fair question to ask, right? And you have 2 tournaments. We'll get to the Division 4 World Championships in a little bit as well, but early signs indicate and rumors circulating are that Georgia will end up hosting this tournament, assuming it does not get canceled before then. But you look at it for this tournament, right? It's going to be a pretty competitive one. I'd say early signs, you can assume that Croatia, Serbia, I'd say Georgia as well will be teams that are very competitive at this tournament. We'll see whether or not the Georgians are going to be able to kind of get to that next stage up. Obviously, they dominated the Division 2B tournament last year, but we're going to see if they're able to continue that success going forward into the Division 1B or Division 2A level rather for this tournament. Should be interesting to keep an eye on there. For Croatia, team coming down, they were pretty competitive at the 1B tournament last year. I'd expect them to be kind of that entering favorite for the promoted spot from this year's tournament, assuming it does end up going forward. But in the end, for the Division 2A tournament this year for the Men's World Championships, kind of hanging in the balance right now. We'll see, of course, whether or not there is going to be any impact there. Likely we'll have a decision over the next week or so, probably a little bit later on, maybe a little bit longer than that. But you would expect, especially with the kind of the original tournament schedule for April 20th, we'll see whether or not they are going to have an announcement before then, if they do end up changing the location, or whether this tournament does end up getting pushed later in the year. And then the other tournament, which is the Men's Division 4 World Championships, which will feature Singapore, who's the Division 3B relegated team, Armenia, Kuwait, Indonesia, Iran, and Malaysia. And so for this tournament, it's going to be a little bit more interesting. Supposed to be held in Kuwait City, Kuwait, from April 12th to April 18th. Does not appear so that will continue as of right now. This tournament likely ends up getting canceled. We'll see whether or not they're going to have any new host kind of coming in last minute. But as of this current moment, does not appear that this tournament will continue to progress. Obviously, subject to change. Rumors come out just about every day about these tournaments. So we'll see from that perspective whether anything is going to end up changing. But especially given the fact that it's a Division 4 tournament, you take also into consideration the fact that with the teams that are in it, not necessarily going to be that competitive at the Division 3B level. You kind of think about the teams coming down. For Singapore, who was blown out 61-4 over 5 games at last year's Division 3B tournament. Armenia maybe can be a little bit more of that competitive type team. Kuwait as well has been knocking on the door. They were hoping to get that home ice advantage at this year's tournament, but realistically, Indonesia probably going to get blown out. Iran likely going to get blown out. Malaysia definitely going to get blown out. And so as much as, especially for a Division 2A tournament, there's a little bit more emphasis on, well, we do want to try and get ourselves back. I do think that this Division 4 tournament may not be as pressed to kind of find that quick solution. Definitely something to keep an eye on there. But in the end, Division 4 tournament from April 12th to April 18th in Kuwait going to end up being moved, canceled, or rescheduled. We'll see which of those options it's going to end up being. Same thing with the Division 2A tournament. Division 2A tournament, though, once again, likely going to be heading to Georgia. We'll have our full news, and you can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, X, TikTok, all of those here on YouTube as well in our community section. We will have that breaking news as soon as it's out. So be sure to hit the like, subscribe, follow, all of those buttons. And of course, once again, we will have that information out for you. Hopefully by the next podcast, it might end up being a little bit longer than that. But as of this current moment, once again, Georgia likely going to end up hosting the Division 2A World Championships and the Division 4 tournament. No kind of suggested potential there, but things move quickly, especially with the IIHF. Something to absolutely keep an eye on there, which then brings us on to the third topic of discussion today, and we shift back to the World Juniors. And the World Juniors with the Americans' new head coach, with Adam Nightingale getting the reins for this American team. You think back to the most recent World Junior tournament with Bob Motzko, not necessarily the end result they would have liked, taking home a 5th place finish at that tournament, losing to the Finns in the quarterfinal round. And it was a bit of a shaky tournament throughout for this American team. And you knew that a head coach change was coming. I didn't expect Motzko to be back, especially when you think back to the 2 years prior with David Carl, who frankly kind of led this American team to the gold medal, taking home back-to-back gold medals in 2024 and 2025. But with Nightingale, you present kind of a new option, and he's a little bit more so about the team atmosphere, a little bit more so kind of playing that team game, the dirty type game, controlling the puck and playing down below the line. And I think that's what this American team kind of needs. And you think to kind of their big losses from this year's tournament, some of the lessons they learned. They almost lost to the Slovaks at this tournament. They almost lost to, they ended up losing to the Finns, of course. Their game against the Swedes, I'd say, was definitely a back and forth one, and their team and their kind of structure favored that in their own kind of way. But for the Americans, Nightingale presents a new opportunity to not only kind of reshape the way that they play and the way that they structure their game on the junior level. He represents an opportunity to get themselves back onto the podium. And think back to his tenure and kind of where he started out his career. He was a video coach, started in the NHL, then kind of transitioned into the Men's World Championships, the World Juniors, and he eventually evolved himself into the assistant coach of the Detroit Red Wings in the NHL in 2019. He did that for a year, and then he shifted over back to the junior level, spending time with the National Training Development Program, that's the US NTDP, from 2020 to 2022, and then he earned himself the 2022 Men's U18 head coaching role, in which he did earn his 2nd place finish. And in many ways, you think about that tournament back in 22, and the Americans had probably one of the best teams we've seen at that tournament. They dominated throughout. But in the end, they were stunned by a Swedish team that, frankly, kind of banded together and ended up beating them. But not necessarily any fault of their own. It was a tight game. It was a competitive one. But unfortunately for them, just following up a little bit short. And then from there, of course, once you lose at those tournaments, you tend to get replaced. Of course, we saw that with the World Juniors this year with Motzko out. But then kind of came a little bit of, well, what's next, right? And he ends up going to Michigan State, where he served his time. He's going to continue there now. He's still there now. A 2-time Big Ten champ in 2023-2024, as well as 2024-2025 season. And then he's also a 3-time regular season Big Ten champ in 2023-24, 24 and 25, the same years that they ended up winning that tournament, or that playoffs. Kind of that's how it works, is you have the regular season, you play there, you go on to a tournament. So there's 2 kind of ways to win your own conference. But then they also won this year, the 2025-2026 year, with, of course, the unfortunately falling just short in that semifinal round. A tough loss for them there, getting eliminated. But in the end, he's the kind of coach that you look to turn around a program. He's done an excellent job over at Michigan State, turning them from really nothing into something. And so it's great to see kind of the way that he treats his players. he has a heavy emphasis on creating that kind of professional environment and turning them into players, not just who are kind of teenagers, college kids, but into professionals. And I think that's exactly what this U.S. team needs moving forward, especially with the crop of players coming in. You think about all their U.S. NTTP guys, likely going to be kind of, not to say high on ego, but it's about controlling the ego and getting them into a structure and a system in place that they can go out and beat teams like Canada, beat teams like Sweden, beat teams like Finland. So a huge opportunity there for them. We'll see, of course, whether or not they are going to end up being able to get themselves back onto the podium and who knows, maybe a gold medal along the way. But that kind of structure and the way that he treats his players also shifts into how he does his coaching, right? And kind of drawing on past experience as a video coach, that's a pretty heavy emphasis on what he does, kind of learning and teaching his players kind of how to play the game the right way, putting in the structure in place. He's also earned himself 2 Big Ten Coach of the Year awards since 2022, so that's 4 or 5 years of seasons now. And so, once again, a huge opportunity here for this American team to continue their success moving forward down the line into the next and potential tournaments. And so we'll see whether or not Nightingale is going to be the knight in shining armor for this American team and lead them on to the promised land. We'll now shift over to topic number 4 of today with the new Canadian GM. And once again, recently announced Doug Armstrong out as Canadian GM, resigning from his post. And for the Canadians, it has been a bit of a tough go, at least this past Olympic Games. And the first GM we thought was going to go was Gina Kingsbury from the women's Olympic program. But in the end, it was Doug Armstrong who was the first domino to fall. And for the Canadians, it presents a huge opportunity. It also presents a bit of a loss, right? And you think to Armstrong's career, where he has been, I don't want to say a staple across the years, but he is the only executive with the triple gold club, which means that he's won 2 times with the Stanley Cup, the Olympic gold medal, and the men's world championship gold medal. And you kind of think to his career and his long storied legacy. You think back to his first one back in 2002, which was an assistant GM at the 2002 World Championships, a 6th place finish there, a senior advisor in 2007, where he took home the gold with the World Championship team, an assistant general manager in 2008, where he came 2nd, general manager in 2009, 2nd place finish as well, senior advisor in 2016, where he took home the gold medal there. And then, of course, his current tenure with this Canadian roster, a gold medal in 2023 at the Worlds, and then a 2024 4th place finish. In a bit of a disappointing fashion, we had quite a rant after that game. A lot of what's your care, what's your why? And so kind of the end of his World Championships tenure, which then leads us on to, well, what else has he done, right? And you think to his Olympic Games tenure. He was the assistant general manager at the 2010 and 2014 Olympic Games. Of course, 2 gold medals there, most notably the Sidney Crosby gold in goal in 2010. And then he was the GM of the Canadian National Olympic Team in this past year in 2026, and that was a 2nd place finish. So his Olympic campaign definitely pretty solidified, I think, to his best on best. As much as, yes, you would have liked to have seen the Canadians take home gold, I do think that this, in the end, was kind of expected, to say the least. And then kind of what else he's done, the World Cup of Hockey back in 2016. He was the GM of that team, and of course, they ended up winning gold at that tournament. Or winning the championship, I guess. There wasn't necessarily for gold at that tournament. And then the other tournaments he's been a part of, he was the management group lead at the 4 Nations Face-Off in 2025, which once again, Canada won the gold medal, the championship at that year's tournament. And so it does present an opportunity, right? We talked about the loss. You lose a guy who's had quite the history with Hockey Canada, with kind of leading Canadian teams in the past. But now it becomes, well, what are they going to do next, right? And I think you kind of look ahead to see, well, who's going to end up being the next guy up for the Canadians as far as their general management staff go. And I would say that there are a few kind of key options, right? And Don Sweeney's a guy who I'd say is kind of that next guy up as of this current moment. He was the GM of the Four Nations team, which ended up going on and winning gold. He was the assistant general manager at the Olympic Games. And so obviously he's with Boston right now as the general manager there. But I do think that especially for a guy like Don Sweeney, where he has had some success on the big stage, he understands how it works now being an assistant general manager with, of course, Doug Armstrong being the GM at this past Olympic Games. I think that in and of itself is a huge opportunity for them to continue to kind of earn that next step up. Obviously, Sweeney's first ever Hockey Canada role as the GM, at least, was the Four Nations face-off. And so whether or not that has any implication on the eventual kind of, I don't want to say, the Olympic next role, the 2030 role, but very likely it will. And I'd say the next guy up would be Jim Nill. And for Nill, he's been a guy that's been around forever, right? And he's the kind of guy you go to when you need advice. Whether or not he's better served as an assistant GM still remains to be the question. But in the end, I think you kind of look at kind of that tier ranking of who you'd expect to be the next one up. I would say Don Sweeney is the obvious leading candidate, especially after being selected to be the GM at the Four Nations face-off. Feels in many ways that they're kind of preparing him for the eventual replacement role for Doug Armstrong for the 2030 Olympics. Julien Brisebois is another one who I'd say definitely has the potential. I don't know whether or not he'll be even considered for this role. I think he should at the very least be a thought. I don't know whether or not he will be considered, but you think about kind of his track record, he's done pretty well for himself over the years. Joe Sakic's another one, is another name that's kind of thrown in there as well. And so we'll see, right? And it's part of the beauty of it is, well, who's the next guy up? Who's the next coach or the GM up for this Canadian program, a storied program. And then there's a few other options where I'd say not necessarily kind of favorites, but Kyle Dubas for me is a guy that you look to as kind of a potential option, right? And I'd say in many ways, Dubas has always kind of been obviously a younger guy. He's the kind of guy, though, that can lead you for multiple years. And I'm not sure if that's what Canada wants right now. But if it is, it presents a huge opportunity. And I think realistically, he'll be an AGM, an assistant general manager, before that span, before he eventually takes over. But I do think Dubas is absolutely a kind of guy that you look to end up leading this Canadian team at some point, whether it's in the near future, whether it's in the long distance future. We've seen what he can do, especially, of course, with the Leafs. A bit of a disappointment there with the Penguins. Once again, another little bit of a disappointment there. But we'll see whether or not he is going to be able to lead this Canadian team at some point into his career. And then some other fun ones, I'd say, is Sidney Crosby is another guy who I'd say very well could take a step into the general management position. You think way down the line, he's definitely an option for them. Probably not going to be the 2030 guy, but potentially 2034 further down the line as he gets into his general management career. Could exist a possibility there. Should be interesting to say the least. But a huge opportunity now with the opening for Doug Armstrong out as Canadian GM of the Canadian Olympic team. And we'll see who ends up taking his place as probably one of the most popular and grossly contested positions in all of international hockey. We'll shift on now to the fifth topic of discussion with the Division 1A hopefuls. And for this, there are a few that I really want to discuss, and that's the Men's World Championships and the Women's World Championships. And so we'll start here with the Men's World Championships, where, of course, we will have Kazakhstan, France, Ukraine, Japan, Poland, and Lithuania taking on each other. This will happen in Snowiec. Poland 2 spots on the line for promotion. And so we'll see whether or not there is going to be the potential for some of these teams to kind of make their mark and earn their way back up, happening from May the 2nd to May the 8th. And so it will be very interesting to see. And so whenever you take a look at these tournaments, there's a few things to keep an eye on. The first are what we like to call the elevator teams, the teams that come down, eventually go back up, right? And so I would say that realistically, you're kind of looking at 2 teams for that. And that is Kazakhstan and France, obviously 2 teams that just came down from the top division level. But this year, I'd say it's a little bit more contested than in years past. You're looking at teams like Ukraine and Poland to kind of earn their way back into the spotlight. And so, of course, we'll see whether or not there are going to be that kind of potential for Ukraine, who I'd say has been on the climb the last few years and has kind of missed out in many ways on that top spot. But they were the 3rd seed in 2025. They've never been to the top group, but they were the next team in at last year's Division 1A Men's World Championship tournament. They lost to Japan on the final day, who was way lower than them in the standings. They lost 3-2. If they would have won that game, they would have been promoted to the top group for this year's tournament. Unfortunately for them, falling just a little bit short. And so we look at it for the Division 1A level, right? There's Ukraine, who I'd say is kind of that next team up. I don't want to call them favorites at the tournament because they are a little bit lower than France and Kazakhstan, but they are right there with them. The other team that presents a little bit of an interesting one are the hosts. And the hosts with Poland, I'd say, present probably one of the most interesting parts of this entire tournament, right? Where on home ice, what we've seen in years past is that teams play progressively better and better than anticipated. And I would expect that to continue at this year's tournament, where you look at it for Poland, 5th place finish at last year's tournament, avoiding relegation by a single spot. And as much as, yes, it was still kind of a tournament where they were competitive throughout, they still do have that potential to earn their way back up into the top group. Will they be able to do it? Who knows, right? And you think about it, their last appearance was in 2024, where they were unfortunately relegated, but they are a kind of team, they have the kind of the composition and structure to be able to make a lasting impact. And so at this tournament in particular, you add on the fact that they're on home ice, there's a huge opportunity there to continue that success, and kind of rewrite the narrative that they are a team that's going to be competitive at these tournaments. Should be interesting, to say the least. And then we will shift over to the women's side of the bracket. And for the women's side, it's another kind of mixed bag type of tournament, where I'd say even more so than the men's side, as far as competitiveness goes. You have 2 elevator teams with Norway and Hungary, where those 2 teams, of course, coming down from the top group last year's tournament. With the recent restructuring at the Women's World Championship top division, there's only going to be 1 team promoted at this year's tournament, where years past there's been 2. This year's it's only going to be 1. And so we look at this and it becomes an absolute dogfight, right? And for Norway, obviously they beat Hungary last year at the Women's Worlds. They're going to look to continue that success moving forward. But you look at the overall tournament, for Hungary, I'd say they had the better tournament. They struggled to score. They didn't have all that great of a kind of final there, but they absolutely earned their way through. And so for Hungary, I would say that they're likely kind of favorites heading in. Norway's very close. It's ultimately going to come down to if Hungary can score, they can play defensively well enough to end up winning games. It's just a matter if really they can end up scoring their way through. Should be interesting to say the least. Then you shift to kind of the other 2 teams in here that I'd say are definite contenders, with France and with Italy, where we saw them at the most recent Olympic Games. France got walked through at that tournament, a bit of a disappointing tournament for them there. But then you had Italy, where I would say for the Italians, it was probably one of the best tournaments they could have had. And kind of doubling up on it, you also look at, well, what else is to come, right? And they have the opportunity to continue their success at this year's Women's World Championships. Yes, it is going to be a little bit later in the term, but for the Italians, it's going to be very interesting to see, to say the least, whether or not they are going to be able to continue their success from the Olympic Games, end up earning their top spot promotion. They are the promoted team at this year's tournament. But then you also look a little bit around, right? And I'd say China is the kind of team that I don't want to say that they are probably the favorite to be relegated, but very much so a team that I wouldn't say is favored to end up taking home the promoted spot at this year's tournament. For Slovakia, it becomes a bit of an interesting bag too, because you look at them, you think back to last year's tournament, they were the third place team. And now you get some reinforcements. We've seen kind of the impact and what the Slovaks have been doing at the women's U18 tournament. You can go rewatch our recap videos on YouTube for that. But it's been kind of a run for the Slovak women's program, and I expect that to continue, right? And Nila Lapushanova had probably one of the best, if not the best, tournaments at the women's U18. She set a number of records at that tournament. And so the question now remains is she going to be able to bring that over onto the big stage at this year's Division 1A tournament? Because once again, if she is, likely you're going to see the Slovaks competing for that top spot. Is it likely they do? I'm not quite sure. But in the end, Italy, France, Slovakia, I'd say are kind of your next three teams up. Norway and Hungary are very much so kind of leading favorites as of this point. But still, once again, very likely that changes. It should be interesting to say the least. And as far as my predictions go, for the men's world championships, my two teams that I'm going to end up predicting are Kazakhstan, and I didn't really think this through before I did it, but I'm going to go with Ukraine as my second team. I think France has fallen behind quite a bit over the last few years. We saw it at the Olympic Games, and I don't expect it to all of a sudden kind of fix itself. I expect Ukraine to end up taking over France, and maybe Poland too ends up higher than France. Might be a little bit of my long shot in the dark at this year's tournament. But in the end, France, I think we've seen what they can do. It's going to be a very tough draw for them. Should be fascinating, to say the least. But in the end, my two teams I'm taking to be promoted on the men's Division 1A perspective is Kazakhstan and Ukraine. As for the women's side, I'm going to take Norway or Hungary. I think in the end it will end up being Norway, but I would like to take Hungary just because of the fact and how well they play defensively. If they can find the back of the net at all at this year's tournament, they are going to go very far because they can play really well defensively. But as I said at the start, this tournament is probably going to be one of the most competitive tournaments we have. Norway, Hungary, Slovakia, France, and Italy. 5 teams who are incredibly tight with one another. China a little bit on the other side of that, kind of dealing with the fallout of the 2022 Olympic Games. We'll see whether or not they are going to be able to find their way back. But in the end, I am going to take Hungary to be my promoted team at the Women's World Championship. Which then leads us on to the next topic of discussion. With the World Cup of Hockey coming back for 2028, it was recently announced that the host locations for this tournament, there will be 3 of them. The first one will be in Prague, Czechia, as well as Edmonton with the Rogers Place, which will Edmonton, Canada, Alberta, as well as Calgary, Alberta, Canada, which will happen at Scotia Place. Edmonton for Rogers Place, and then Prague will be the O2 Arena. And so a huge tournament. It's going to happen February 2028. Great to see the best on best return to the ice. And then it becomes, well, which teams are going to be a part of this, right? And I think there are kind of the teams that you can obviously pick as far as predictions go, where, Canada and the Czechs have to be in there because they're hosts. So you're not going to get rid of them. The USA, Sweden, Finland also basically locks to be a part of that. Switzerland, I think, is more or less a lock for this tournament. I'd be absolutely shocked if they weren't in it. But at the same time, there is the kind of that discussion of, well, they're not necessarily a part of the big four. They shouldn't necessarily be considered locks because you could replace them with Germany, Slovakia, those kind of teams. But in the end, I do expect Switzerland to be a part of this and as kind of that lock team. Then you have a bit more of the question marks. And what I would say as, teams that could be there might not be there. And I think Germany and Slovakia are the 7 and 8 seed pretty confidently as of this current moment, where once again your tournament would consist of Canada, the USA, Sweden, Finland, Czechia, Switzerland, Germany, and Slovakia. But there is an argument to be made for Latvia as a team who I'd say could very well find themselves in this group, a team well known for their commitment to defensive structure, a team that's caused problems for for Canada, the US in the past. It's Sweden as well I'd throw in there. But ultimately, it's going to come down to which team is kind of the best available. And that's what Commissioner of the NHL, Gary Bettman, said in his press conference was, we're going to take the 8 best available teams at this tournament. And so the question becomes as well, who else could be in there? Latvia, I'd say, is a team that could definitely rival them. Denmark, I'd say, is a team that could sneak in. Very unlikely. I'd say Latvia is definitely the kind of that next team in as of this current moment. Or, of course, for Denmark, they just beat Canada at the recent Men's World Championship back in 2025. And so we'll see whether or not that's going to have any implication. Austria is an interesting one as well. They had quite the run at the most recent Men's World Championship. I don't expect them to be a part of this tournament, but still a potential there. Norway's another one who I'd say could sneak in. Very unlikely, though, especially given the fact kind of where they are in the rankings on the men's side. Probably not going to be a contender. But the other name who I'd say is kind of the name that most people will be drawing from is, well, where's Russia, right? And I mean, Russia seems to become a pretty common theme of these podcasts and of these videos, is kind of, well, they're not going to be there. And for our NHL fans who don't necessarily keep up with international hockey, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So long as the war continues in Ukraine, Russia won't be back at these tournaments. Finland, Sweden, and Czechia have already said that if Russia is a part of this tournament, they won't be there so long as the war continues. So unless in the next year and a bit or so ends up changing that, which once again, very unlikely, that will likely end up being Russia not at this tournament. Very unlikely that it happens in the first place. But it does present kind of the question mark of, well, what to expect from this tournament, right? Where, assuming it is Canada, the USA, Sweden, Finland, Czechia, Switzerland, Germany, and Slovakia, you can set up your groups kind of accordingly, right? And for those who don't know, there's 2 groups. Calgary is going to host the one group for the Canadian and North American side. And then on the other side, Czechia and Prague are going to host the other group. And so in the Czech group, I would assume that we will see Sweden, Finland, Czechia, and then from there, probably either Germany or Slovakia. On the Canadian side in Calgary, I would expect Canada and the US to be in the group. Switzerland, I think, will be kind of that obvious next team in, just because you look at it, Canada and the US should end up going out and beating Switzerland. And for the NHL, they want Canada and the US as that final matchup. That's just how they're going to design the tournament, because tickets sell, North American fans watch the NHL, and so that's what they're really trying to do at the end of the day. And so Switzerland, I think, presents the least likely option to kind of pull off that upset against them in that in that preliminary round. And then Germany and Slovakia, I'd say, is kind of a coin flip between the two as to which team ends up there. They could put Czechia and Switzerland in the same group, kind of make it a death group with Sweden, Finland, Czechia, and Switzerland, kind of stack up the European side, and then put Germany and Slovakia with Canada and the US. I don't necessarily think that's what they'll do because, once again, they have to give off the impression that they're not trying to stack the groups, but at the same time, they are kind of trying to do that. And so then it sets up the semifinals. So how the semifinals work is the top team from the Czech group plays the second spot in the Canada group. Second spot in Czech group plays top spot in Canada group. And so what that means, and kind of if we're looking ahead into this tournament, Canada and the US likely going to be your 1-2s out of the Canadian group. Czech group, you'll likely see either Sweden, Finland, or Czechia. Out of that group, I think it's going to be a very competitive group, and I think most people are looking at it and saying, well, the Swedes and the Finns, they're the Four Nations team, so they should be going forward. But you watch Czechia and Finland enough, you know that game is going to be real tight right to the end. And it wouldn't surprise me to see this end up being a three-way tie where Sweden beats the Czechs, Czechia beats Finland, Finland beats Sweden, and then all of a sudden, kind of that whole tiebreaker scenario comes back into play. Very excited to see how this tournament ends up developing. A huge opportunity for the game to continue to grow, but it will be definitely fascinating to see kind of how far this tournament ends up going. Of course, the playoffs will be in Edmonton, held at Rogers Place, and so we'll see. The World Cup of Hockey returning. More best-on-best hockey, February 2028, replacing the NHL All-Star Game for our NHL friends who are over watching this or listening to this. Kind of, that's what you can expect for this tournament. Your likely teams as of this current moment: Canada, the USA, Sweden, Finland, Czechia, Switzerland, Germany, Slovakia. My favorite to win gold early on, it's probably going to be between Canada and the US again. The Swedes, the Finns, the Czechs, all going to be competitive in that semifinal matchup, but I do think that in the end, one of the North American teams does take it again. Canada or the US should be exciting to say the least. That is the World Cup of Hockey coming February 2028. We'll now shift into our final topic of discussion today, and that is the men's U18 tournament and the NHL draft. And so we typically don't do this on our main channel for our YouTube side, and that is we're going to kind of highlight some key players for this upcoming U18 tournament that will eventually kind of shape out to be this upcoming NHL entry draft. And so for those who don't know, the men's U18 tournament from April 22nd to May the 2nd, we will have full coverage of it on our YouTube channel. So be sure to come over and subscribe to the On The Fly YouTube channel. And so what it is the best under 18 players, which means 2008 borns or later, 2009, 2010. And so there is a little bit of carryover with the NHL draft, as obviously the NHL draft, you have some 07 players, and some of the top players end up drafted in 07, kind of later born 07 players, as well as 2008 born players. And so for this kind of segment, we're going to look at some of those players that we will likely see at the men's U18 tournament coming up in April. For those that are interested, these are the groups for this tournament. You have Canada, who won last year's tournament in Group A, Slovakia, the 4th place finisher, Finland, the 5th place finisher, Latvia and Norway, the 8th and 9th place finisher. All those teams are in Group A and will play each other. In Group B, you have Sweden, the USA, Germany, Czechia, and Denmark. Denmark, the Division 1A promoted team from last year's Division 1A men's U18 tournament. And so, yes, right, and it's part of the joys of it is you kind of look ahead and you're trying to take guesses on, A, which teams are going to be good, B, which teams are actually going to allow their players to go, because for those who don't know, it's right in the middle of quite a few different seasons, being at the end of April, early May. You run into conflicts with the CHL playoffs, and so for Canada, you tend to see a team that is good. Some teams, you kind of lose a bit of that talent pool. But especially with the NIL allowing many players to go down south and go play NCAA hockey, it does present a bit of an interesting conversation there. But still, right, you look at it, Canada, Slovakia, Finland, Latvia, Norway. This year in particular, I would say Canada and Finland are two teams to definitely keep your eyes on. In Group B, likely once again going to be Sweden, the USA. The Czechs have some really good talent at this year's tournament. Wouldn't surprise me to see them be competitive, definitely more so than they were last year. The Slovaks have had some really good goaltending in the past. They lost their goaltender for this tournament, Mikel Pradl. We'll see whether or not that has any implication on the grand scheme of things. But in the end, some of the players to definitely keep an eye on. We'll start here with the number 1 seed with Canada. And for Canada, there's 2 players to kind of keep an eye on, and there's obviously a lot more. But as of this current moment and who's expected to play in this tournament, because once again, you have to take into consideration the fact that not all the best players from Canada are going to be at this tournament, given that they will have to play in the CHL playoffs. But as far as the draft hopefuls go for Canada, you have Tynan Lawrence, who's the number 7th ranked draft pick at this year's NHL draft. A center with 18 games played so far for Boston University in the NCAA. He has 2 goals for 5 assists for 7 points. And for him, he's kind of a smarter type player. You can expect him to be on the World Junior team next year. And he was kind of a guy that was right there with them throughout the entire selection process, left off the initial camp roster. But in the end, we'll see whether or not he is going to be able to find his way on next year's World Junior team. Obviously, Canada's hosting it out in Alberta, so we'll see whether or not they will be able to pick up a guy like Lawrence. Should be interesting, and also depending on where he gets drafted this year, whether or not he goes straight to the NHL. I don't expect that. I don't think he's quite there yet, at least to this point, but I think he does have definitely a pretty high ceiling, really good two-way forward, two-way center with the ability to put the puck in the back of the net. We'll see what he's going to be able to do at this year's tournament. See if he can turn some eyes at this men's U18 tournament. Huge opportunity there. The other player for Canada is Keaton Verhoff. We saw him with the World Junior team this past December, this past January. But you look at his game, he's a tall right shot defenseman, right? Or left defenseman. And he's the kind of guy that you look to kind of log those minutes, right? And he's the guy you can trust in just about any situation. He's playing with North Dakota in the NCAA. 33 games played, 6 goals, 14 points, or 14 assists for 20 points. And so he's the kind of guy that you look to provide that shutdown role. He can move players out front. He's a physical defender. He's going to grow into his size. He had some struggles, especially on the World Junior stage, kind of playing a little bit more of the physical side, but he showed flashes of it. He has a lot of size. He'll grow into that. He's a fast skater. He's quick, especially given his size. And so he's kind of the guy that you look to as that first defenseman out of the draft gate. He has a huge opportunity at this men's U18 to distinguish himself even further. I'm excited to see what he can do at this upcoming men's U18 tournament. A huge opportunity for him to continue to grow his draft stock, not only as, of course, the already number 3 on the list, but potentially also finding his way to the number 1 spot. Should be interesting, to say the least. Then we go to the number 2 seed with Sweden. And for the Swedes, a few players to keep an eye on, right? And I'd say there's no one better to start with than Viggo Bjork, who time after time has shown himself to be probably one of the best players on the ice on any given international team he's been a part of. A returning guy from last year's team. He currently sits as the number 10 overall draft pick, or projected number 10 overall. 42 games played, 6 goals, 9 assists for 15 points with Djurgårdens in the Swedish Hockey League. And so as much as, yes, I'd say that he's the kind of guy who goes to the dirty areas, he's not necessarily known or considered to be that number 1 overall draft pick. He's the kind of guy that you want to have on your team, because of the fact that he is probably one of the more skilled players we've seen. He can play shorthanded minutes. He can play power play minutes. He has great passing. He's got a great shot. And I think this is his opportunity once again to remind everybody that although he's playing in Sweden, when you put him up against the best North American skaters at his age, he is going to deliver when that moment comes and that door ends up bringing. He has a huge opportunity here at this year's tournament to end up kind of solidifying himself as not just probably the best player of his age group, but also at this tournament. He's the guy I have my eyes on at this year's men's U18s to really lead the charge and maybe even find himself into the higher echelon end of this draft. He's the kind of guy, once again, if he's a foot taller, if he's 6 inches taller, if he's not a 5'11", 6'1" player, he would be the number one overall at this draft. But unfortunately, not necessarily the size you're looking for, but Viggo Bjork, the kind of guy you want to see at this men's U18 tournament. And he's also a returning guy, same with Verhoff. We'll see what they can do for their respective teams. The other player I'm keeping my eye on for Sweden is Malte Gustafsson, a left-shot defenseman. Number 17 overall projected as of this current moment for this draft. 19 games played, 4 goals, 8 assists for 12 points with HV 71 in the under-20 Swedish Hockey League. And so we'll see for him whether or not he's going to be able to continue to put forth strong performances. He's the kind of guy who I would say you're expecting to play a little bit more of that shutdown type role. Yes, he can play well offensively, and yes, he can find and generate some chances. But in the end, I do expect him to kind of take on another role at this year's tournament. A guy I have my eyes on to improve his draft stock moving forward into this tournament. A huge opportunity for him there. We will now move on to the third team of today with the USA. And we'll start here with the U.S. with the only returning guy, with Mikey Burchild, who I'd say for Burchild, you look at him, returning guy, 58th overall as of this current moment, as far as projected draft stock, but he has room to grow, right? And he's 47 games played, 17 goals, 26 assists for 43 points with the NTDP, National Training Development Program. But especially for him, I would say there's the potential to kind of find his way up at this tournament. And part of the beauty of these IIHF tournaments is it really is best on best of the age group. And so you can see the players that, are going, say 20, say 10, go up against players that might not necessarily get to play against those guys in their league play. I'm excited to see what Burchild can do at this year's tournament. I think there's a huge opportunity there for him, and we'll see whether or not he is going to be able to kind of put forth a returning type performance coming back from last year's team. The other one is JP Hurlburt, who's the 22nd overall projected spot for this NHL draft. 67 games played, 42 goals, 54 assists for 96 points with the Kamloops Blazers in the WHL. And for him, he's the kind of guy that, once again, 67 games, 96 points, right? And point producer type player, you look for him for some offense, and he will be definitely a pretty solid player for your team. But especially in the U18 context for the tournament, you're going to look to him to show off his skills, find the back of the net, find those passing lanes, and if he can do that, he might just earn himself into the top 15, top 10, where right now he's sitting at 22nd. There is the opportunity for him to continue to move up, especially at this kind of tournament. A huge opportunity there for him. We'll see what he can do, JP Hurlburt and Mikey Burchild for the U.S. We'll now move on to the fourth team on the list with the Slovaks. And for Slovakia, there's one player that I have my eyes set on for this tournament with Adam Golgier, who's a returner. He was number 42 overall projected at this NHL entry draft as of this current moment. 43 games played, 4 goals, 7 assists for 11 points. He's currently playing with HK Dukla Trenčín in the Slovak Extraliga. But he's a kind of guy that we've seen him in quite a few different IIHF tournaments over the years. And he's the kind of guy that I would say you're expecting to have a breakthrough performance at this tournament. He's the kind of guy the Slovak team is going to look to kind of lead the way. And so when you have that expectation on you, there is a bit more pressure, yes, but also opportunity to shine through. And we've seen that at the World Juniors. You think to Albert Schmitz, who had himself quite the tournament there, then got himself an Olympic spot, now kind of projected to go fairly high at the upcoming NHL entry draft as well. But for Gaugier, you're going to look for him to kind of be that next guy up. And so we'll see whether or not he's going to be able to break through at this tournament. Currently sitting at 42nd. Realistically, I could see him dropping down into the first round. Going to be very exciting, to say the least, whether or not he is going to be able to find that breakthrough. But definitely a guy to keep your eyes on, because he is definitely a player that could move up into the top 30. Then you move to the fifth team of our list with Finland. And for Finns, there's two guys who I really have my eyes set on. Oscar Hemming, who's the number 13th overall projected pick. 19 games played, 1 goal, 7 assists for 8 points with Boston College in the NCAA. But for him, he's the kind of guy that you give him his opportunities, he's not going to miss it. And we saw that especially at the most recent World Juniors, where him, as well as Oliver Suvanto, who's the number 15th projected pick at the draft, 48 games played, 2 goals, 9 assists for 11 points with Tappara in the Finnish Elite League. He's another guy who I would say between the two of them have the potential to really shine at this tournament. And we kind of talked a little bit about those power rankings early. Those are the two guys you're going to look to really lead this Finnish charge, especially on the offensive side, where they play with a lot of pace, they play with a lot of structure as well. But you couple the fact that every Finnish team needs at least one goal scorer on it. Hemming and Suvanto, two guys who I'm looking to really lead that offensive punch, to kind of help the Finns, not only in terms of their own draft stock, but also get themselves higher in the standings, higher in this tournament, and end up winning some games. Two guys who I'd say have not only the potential to move up in this draft, 13 and 15 right now, Hemming and Suvanto, but also later in the tournament as well. Should be interesting to see what kind of performances they can put forth. But then we'll move on to Germany. And there's really only one player, I'd say, for Germany that I have my eyes set on as of this current moment, with Darian Rosling. And for Rosling, returning guy, he's around the 200th rated spot. The Germans don't have a ton of NHL talent, or NHL draftable talent at this year's tournament. Yes, you could have some surprises, especially late as these drafts go onwards. But as of this current moment, Rolsing for me is kind of the guy who I have my eyes set on for this German team. 61 games played as a defenseman, 1 goal, 6 assists for 7 points with the Wenatchee Wild in the WHL. And so we'll see, right? And so especially for a team like Germany, where you're kind of, I don't want to say it's a down year for them, but not necessarily expected to be as competitive as normal. I do think that there is the potential for them to move up, and especially as we start to see which players are released for this tournament, the WHL will have their playoffs over this stretch, and so whether or not we even get to see some of these players becomes the other question mark. And part of the beauty of this U18 tournament is that we are still a month out, but it's hard to predict who ends up becoming available. So I'd say Rolsing for the Germans is really the only guy who has NHL prospects or potential. Should be interesting to see, to say the least, there for this German team. Then on to the Czechs. And so for the Czechs, with the 7th spot, I'd say there are a few players that really have the opportunity to move up into this draft. We'll start in the left wing with Szymon Katalitsky, who's a returning player, number 74 projected as of this current moment. 29 games played for 6 goals, 11 assists for 17 points with Tappara in the U20 Finnish Elite League. And so for Katalitsky, you're kind of looking whether or not he is going to be able to kind of take his game to the next level. He's a guy that this Czech team will look to, especially for that kind of offensive side, a left winger as well, which is a bit more unique, especially coming into these tournaments where you see a lot of players that play a lot of center. And so we'll see whether or not that kind of niche gets him drafted earlier in this tournament. A huge opportunity to move up, especially with international game. We'll see whether or not he is going to be able to eventually take his next spot. The other Czech to kind of keep an eye on is Jakub Vanecek, number 60 overall. He was a part of the World Junior selection process. He never actually played for the team. He never actually was signed or put on the roster. From back to that kind of weird stage where they announced half their roster, they didn't announce their full one. And so for Vanecek, I'd say you look to him kind of to be a little bit more that offensive-minded defenseman. As of this current moment, 58 games played, 14 goals for 21 assists for 35 points with the Tri-City Americans in the WHL. Also another CHL player. We'll see whether or not that has any implication on his eventual eligibility for this tournament. But in the end, I do think that, especially for Vanecek, it's a huge opportunity there for him to get higher, especially not getting to play at the World Juniors, to get to see him on the big stage at the international tournaments. He's a guy who I definitely have my eyes set on. We'll see whether or not he's going to be able to kind of find his way through with a huge performance at this year's men's U18 tournament. Then we'll shift to number 8 with Latvia. And for the Latvians, there's a few guys who I really have my eyes set on at this tournament with Oliver Murniks, who is a returning player, number 73, projected at this tournament. Another World Juniors guy, 31 games played, 7 goals, 13 assists for 20 points with the St. John Sea Dogs in the QMJHL. And so we look at kind of Murniks as a player who very well could end up finding his way through. We'll see whether or not he's going to be able to kind of earn his draft stock at this tournament. This Latvian team, I would say, has a pretty good core right now. They could become an upset type team over in that Group A. We'll see whether or not they're going to be able to do it. But especially for teams, like Canada, where we've seen them struggle, especially in the past, against teams like Latvia, could be a bit of an interesting one there. And I know the haunts or the scars continue to grow for their Canadian friends, but still, Latvian team, a really good one as well as Rudolf Burzkowns, number 112 overall as of this current moment, 42 games played, 11 goals, 12 assists for 23 points with the Muskegon Lumberjacks of the USHL. He's a center as well, and so once again, players you're going to look to for this Latvian team to kind of lead their charge. We'll see how much of an impact they are going to end up being able to have. Should be interesting to say the least there. And then move into a little bit more of the niche teams with Norway, who I'd say really only has one player that you want to keep an eye on for the draft. That's Nicholas Aram Olsen, who's a returning player from last year's tournament, currently projected to go in the first round, number 31 overall. 29 games played, 20 goals, 20 assists for 40 points. With the Orbo HK in the Swedish Hockey League under 20. And so you look for him to kind of be a little bit more of that offensive driver. Going to be Norway's best player at this year's tournament. We'll see whether or not he's going to be able to really lead that charge for this Norwegian team. He's going to be a huge part if Norway wants to avoid relegation more than anything else, because once again, you kind of look across the board, it's going to be a tough tournament for them. But in the end, I think you look to a guy like Aram Olsen to kind of be that driver and that factor for this Norwegian team, or if they want any chance at competing, avoiding relegation, that's their best chance to do so. A returning guy, we'll see what he can do at this year's tournament. And then the final team for our NHL draft men's U18 segment is Denmark. And for Denmark, it's a bit more of a question mark, where I'd say there isn't really any one player that I think could realistically go in this draft. I think you look at up and down their team, this is more so just a player who I think could earn his way into draft considerations, and that's Anton Emil Vilde Larsen, who was the World Juniors goaltender for the Danes. We've seen him over the last few years at this men's U18 tournament, the lower divisions. Obviously, once again, Denmark, the promoted team from Division 1A last year. Larsen was a huge part to that team and why they ended up going as far as they did. And so for the Danes, we'll see whether or not they are going to be able to kind of pull off an upset at this tournament, not get sent back down to the promoted spot. But you even look at their group where, once again, not to get too far into it, we will be having our full tournament preview as well as each individual team as the rosters do get released. But you look at it, right? The Danes trying to realistically upset Germany in their group. Probably not going to be able to beat the Czechs, the US, or the Swedes. And then you look to that eventual relegation matchup where you're probably going up against Norway or Latvia. Probably going to be the two teams that most likely you'll be facing up against. But I would say Latvia has a pretty good team and a pretty good roster at this year's tournament. Should definitely be interesting to say the least. But for Denmark, really only their goaltender, I'd say, has the potential of being drafted. Obviously, still remains to be seen whether or not that changes. But these tournaments provide a sort of that stepping stone, especially for some of those smaller type teams that might not necessarily get the potential to play against the big names in their league play, to get that opportunity on the big stage in front of a lot of NHL scouts. The NHL draft, the men's U18 tournament really do go hand in hand. So be on the lookout for our men's U18 tournament coverage. We will, of course, be doing our tournament previews, tournament predictions, and then individual team previews as well we'll be doing for this tournament. Then, of course, our standard day recaps over on our YouTube channel, so be sure to check that out. As well, we'll be having full coverage here on the podcast as the tournament does get closer. Then we go to everyone's favorite topic, which is live questions. And so if you have not already, be sure to go head over to our YouTube channel, hit the subscribe button, where we will answer your live questions for today. We do our live streams for these podcasts every Sunday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I believe that would be 7 p.m. European Time, and it would be, 10 p.m. or 10 a.m. Pacific Time. So trying to hit all the best of both worlds. We do have a few comments out early today. See what we got. Women's Division 1A will be difficult to predict. All teams look to be at evenly matched, and that's exactly right. And I think it's part of the beauty of these tournaments is, especially for the Women's World Championships, right? You look at kind of who they're going up against. Norway realistically should be a top division team. Hungary, I'd say, is probably the best team out of all of them. They just struggle to score. They're the best structural team at the very least, especially for what they need to do. They have a really good commitment to that tactical structure. Slovakia, I would say, is a sleeping giant. Time will tell there whether or not they're able to break through. France, I mean, we saw France and Italy at the Olympic Games. They were competitive. I wouldn't say that they were necessarily blow-it-away teams, but they've shown that they can be competitive with the top division teams. Definitely earn their chance to go to the top division. And unfortunately for China, just kind of the last team out here that I wouldn't say necessarily have that next step up as far as the grand scheme of the groups go. But for Italy, a team to keep an eye on. France, a team to keep an eye on. Slovakia, a young team, might be a few years out, but still a team to keep an eye on. And then Norway and Hungary is going to be shocking. And I think that game, whichever way it goes, I'm going to end up being surprised by it. So it should be interesting, to say the least there. And then we go to another one. If Russia doesn't play in the World Cup of Hockey in 2028, the most likely team it will be Slovakia, but I would love to see them back, but I don't think it's happening in 2028. I would agree. I think that's part of it. I'm not going to claim to be a news channel, so I don't really know kind of what's going on there. But from what I've heard, especially kind of sources have said that when you look at what's been going on with Czechia, Sweden, Finland have all said they're not going. Very likely until that war is done, you won't see Russia back in the IIHF. From Johnny, my worries about the World Cup of Hockey is that it's mainly NHL rules. If there is fighting allowed, it's going to be a travesty. And I do believe that there will be NHL rules in it. And so I don't mind the fact that there's going to be fighting. Realistically, you won't see much of it. And I know most people say, well, there's going to be, just because they allow it, there's going to be a lot of it. I don't necessarily think that's true. And I think you also have to take into consideration that it's technically an all-star game, right? And it's not, especially for the NHL side, is that it's technically just an all-star game. And so you're probably not going to get yourself hurt right before the back half of your season, or at least try to. Yes, Four Nations was what they like to call the build-up of a long stretch of years. But in the end, I do think that everything kind of happened the way it did. And there's a pretty good reason why it didn't happen again in that final game, because once again, fighting's allowed doesn't mean you have to fight if you get that opportunity. It should be interesting, to say the least. I think, especially for the World Cup, I'm very excited to see it, because you have the best on best: Canada, the U.S., Sweden, Finland, Czechia. Switzerland's going to be a part of it too, and I'm missing some teams in there. Czechia. And so I'm absolutely thrilled to see what's to come for that tournament. I think you're going to have one major upset that's going to throw a wrench into everything, especially in a 4-team group. But I do think that there is one huge upset incoming, and I would love to see Slovakia. And we kind of talked a little bit earlier about those potential groups. But you think kind of in that Czech group, the group in Czechia, Czechs, Finland, Sweden, and Slovakia. You have Slovakia, Sweden, and Finland again from the Olympics. That, for me, would be top-tier television, to see if Slovakia could pull off yet another upset against some of the best teams over in that group. Should definitely be exciting. 2028 February can't come soon enough. And actually, neither can really April 22nd or May 15th, right? Because those are the next upcoming events. And then the Women's World Championships coming up later in November. It's going to be exciting. From Nick, the IIHF fan, it will be NHL rules since it's an NHL event, and that's what bothers me. The NHL doesn't want to risk its players at the Olympics, but they want other leagues to risk their players at this event. I mean, that's part of it too. I think after Four Nations was really the first example that we've seen kind of the NHL realize what the impact of having international hockey is. And the fact that they could have a small tournament turn into really kind of the headlines it did and the growth of the game it had, I just think that they weren't going to pass up on that opportunity. And as much as, yes, you're going to end up now risking players, and that's that whole argument that the NHL has kind of prided itself on over the last however many years, you still want to see best on best because it continues to grow the game, and it's just great to see just how many really international hockey fans there's been and the growth of it after a pretty quiet last kind of 12 years, at least on the men's side. I can't imagine the rest of Canada is taking too kindly to Alberta getting their third World Juniors in 7 years and now the World Cup. I mean, that's true. And I mean, you think kind of also, though, it also comes down to, well, how well can they hold those events, right? And Montreal, I'd say, realistically was going to be another kind of contender for this tournament. Toronto, I'd say, is another one. But you kind of want two different markets where you get to expand your reach even further, where I'd say for Calgary and for Edmonton, that's a pretty good mix of places where you get a little bit more of that spread out mentality. And so I'm not sure, right? And I don't know whether or not to be upset about that. Obviously, I enjoyed having the Four Nations in Montreal, eventually shifting back to Boston, but it also kind of comes at a bit of a price, right? And so we'll see moving forward whether or not the IIHF continues to go back to those places. I mean, once you have the ability to sell those tickets out, it normally ends well for you. But even Ottawa with the World Juniors, I think, was a pretty good opportunity there, and it performed pretty much to expectations. They sold out most of the games there. And so I don't think there was really any of those kind of disappointments, to say the least. As a IIHF fan, I don't know how I feel about this World Cup and how the NHL is planning to run it. That's fair. And I think part of it, though, is realistically all the rules. It's still hockey. Yes, you're going to have a little bit more of that physicality, but realistically, it doesn't change all that much from the Olympics. The Olympics, I'd say, there weren't too many problems with it outside of a few problems. If the World Cup of Hockey is to take place, you need to involve at least one team from every continent in the main stage. I think that's where they want to grow with it, right? And I think part of the biggest problem right now, at least that I can see, is you kind of look at the other nations, and especially whether it be Africa, whether it be Asia, and they're just not necessarily there quite yet. And I think like World Cup of football, World Cup of soccer, they have that ability where the game, the parity level is pretty similar throughout the ranks. And yes, you have your teams like England or the UK or whatever they're called on the FIFA stage. You have some of the better teams, but they're still going to be competitive in those games, and it really is always going to be one goal that decides it. Where hockey, you have results that we see at the lower divisions where, once again, it's blowout type games. And so you don't really want that to be your growth of the game, is seeing teams get blown out 75-0, because we see that in the lower divisions and it doesn't necessarily sell. But I do think that at some point, as the game continues to grow, and it's part of the beauty of these international tournaments, is that it has been continuing to grow. I think we're going to see the rise of these African countries, the rise of the Asian countries, of the Oceanic countries. We've seen, of course, the Australians and the New Zealand. We covered their Trans-Tasman series last week on the pod, and so I think that is a huge opportunity to continue to grow the game, and we'll see whether or not there is going to be that kind of impact now and into the future. But that is going to wrap it up for episode number 4 of the On the Fly International Hockey Podcast. A huge thanks to everyone who hung out with us live in the chat today, and for those listening over on the audio version of the program. If you enjoyed our breakdown of the lower division and the state of international hockey, make sure you've hit that subscribe button on YouTube and turned on notifications so you never miss a live stream. For our listeners on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, please give us a follow and a 5-star rating, which helps us grow into one of the biggest hockey podcasts out there. Don't forget to follow us at OnTheFly1515 on Instagram, X, and TikTok for highlights and news throughout the week. I'm your host, Parker McLean, and until next time, see ya.